Morning, everybody. Welcome to another United States Studies Center webinar. Um, we're so pleased to be able to bring these to you, and we're doing about 2 a week at the moment, and so pleased that we've been able to continue to bring an awful lot of content to you through this new medium in these challenging circumstances. And today's a real great treat for us because our guest today is Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who writes for Axios. Now, Axios is a relatively new entrant into the media landscape in the United States. It's a terrific online publication, if you will. But Bethany is charged with managing the China coverage for Axios. And the fact that there is a dedicated China desk at Axios, I think, tells you a lot about sort of what's going on in the United States at the moment, number one, and how a news service looking to distinguish itself, and with a big emphasis on its DC coverage in particular, thought it appropriate and necessary to stand up a separate channel, if you will, dedicated to China that, as I said, Bethany runs. And you can sign up for regular updates from many of the Axios channels, but the one I take Bethany's updates at least once a week, and I'm frequently on the website, on the Axios website, the rest of the time too. Our good friend Jonathan Swan, an expatriate Australian, anchors their White House coverage, for instance, and so many roads for the US Study Center run back to Axios. And today we're really delighted to be hosting Bethany, who at one point we thought might actually be in Australia in 2020. Alas, that didn't turn out to be, but we're nonetheless delighted to have her with us today. Bethany, just some of the career credentials here. I think I ought to introduce Bethany properly and making you aware of this. Bethany is based in Washington. She was the lead writer of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who reported on the body of work collectively known as the China Cables, which detail classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of China's detention camps in Xinjiang province. Prior to coming to Axios, Bethany wrote on national security for the Daily Beast, and she was also an editor and reporter at Foreign Policy magazine. Bethany's academic credentials are second to none. Language training at Middlebury College, a master's degree in East Asian Studies at Yale University, and a graduate certificate from the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies, and has also, in total, has lived in China for 4 years herself. So eminently well qualified for the job that she currently has at Axios, and has been belting it out of the park with the coverage that Axios is producing on China. And why China? Well, let's just briefly talk about that. Look, for the US Study Center, and particularly this US Study Center based in Australia, look, it's only question number one in foreign policy at the moment, and with especially important consequences for Australia. And I guess if you're tuning into this webinar today, you already knew that. There is no greater foreign policy dilemma at the moment than US-China relations. That has been put on steroids, if you will, by COVID-19, which was already on steroids because of the way the Trump administration was prosecuting its relationship with China. And of course, the implications for Australia are immense. Every foreign policy conversation in Australia turns to US-China within about 30 seconds and stays there for the rest of the day. And that's certainly true for us at the US Study Center. And so for that reason, we were so delighted to think that we might have actually had Bethany in Australia earlier this year. We were immensely disappointed when that couldn't come to fruition, but we're so delighted to be able to have this opportunity, the remainder of this hour, with Bethany. Bethany, thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be able to finally join you, even though I wasn't able to come to Australia because of the coronavirus. But thank you for that really kind introduction, Simon. And thanks to everyone who is here. And I look forward to your questions in a few minutes after my presentation. So today I'm going to go ahead and put my slide deck up and get that going. All right. I want to talk about the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the future of America's China policy and what it's doing right now in DC to our conversations on China and to our policy and to our politics here in the US. Sorry, there we go. Right now, the U.S.-China relationship is at a real low. It's the lowest point it's been in possibly decades, and certainly I would say 3 weeks ago that was the case. The week that China kicked out 13 American journalists from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time magazine, I believe. No, the Washington Post. It was the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. That's basically, it's like one step down from kicking out American diplomats. And that was, the result of a kind of a downward spiral. And as Simon mentioned, tensions have been building in the relationship for the past 3 years since Trump's election. And that's especially over the past year as, for example, Secretary Pompeo has gotten a lot more vocal and a lot more confident in his criticisms of China. Trump has, continued to, I think, surprise Chinese leaders in his willingness to really take China head on. The FBI's crackdown on Chinese scientists, not just Chinese scientists, but scientists in the US with ties to Chinese institutions and to the Thousand Talents program. There's been several things, especially in the past year, that have built up. And then in the past 2 months, it's really taken a nosedive. As I said, there's the tit for tat media war, journalist expulsions. We kicked out around 60 media workers who worked for various Chinese state-run news outlets here in the US. And then with the coronavirus, there is intense anger in the US. And it's not just in DC, it's not just politicians, it's across the country. If you look at polling, Americans in general are very angry at China and have the lowest opinion of China in a long time. And that's pretty much across the board. And there's a lot of anger about the way that China has approached its messaging, especially since the beginning of February. Anger about the disinformation that they have put forward, lying about the cover-up, denying the cover-up, putting out claims repeatedly that it was the US military that created the coronavirus and planted it in Wuhan, and that kind of disinformation. So there's intense anger in DC because of that. So that's been the cause there of where we are right now in the relationship. I want to talk about something that's really new, and I have a question mark here. The end of the bipartisan consensus. Maybe we might be looking at the end of what has really been a bedrock of in the U.S. China, the U.S. policy community and in politicians in the U.S., which has been what we call the bipartisan consensus on China, but that appears to be cracking. So for more than 2 years, Republicans and Democrats have, for the most part, agreed that the U.S. needs a China policy that acknowledges Beijing's hard authoritarian turn and the serious challenge that China's growing power presents to U.S. interests. I want to be clear that this consensus represents an attitude, it's a belief that China is a challenge. It's not a comprehensive set of actual policies that everyone agrees should be taken. People have different ideas about what should be done. I would say even more than that, though, there hasn't been a good sense, especially among Democrats or on the left, of what should be done, simply an acknowledgement that there is a problem. So I think in some ways you could say it's a more accurate description of the phenomenon that we're all talking about here is the death of the engagement narrative. The idea that if we engage with China, if we welcome them into institutions, it will somehow magically become like us. And very few people now really hold to that or are willing to at least say that publicly. That seems to have left quite a number of Democrats without much to say at all when it comes to China, particularly particularly on the Hill, I would say. If you look at initiatives and resolutions and draft bills and bills that are actually passed, but I mean, even just draft bills coming out of our representatives on the Hill, Democrats are willing to sign on to a lot of things, but they don't typically lead them. They're not really vocal. Democratic China policy in the past 2 to 3 years has mainly just seemed sort of like Republican light. You know, we'll do what they do, but just like maybe not so meanly. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the consensus. It looks like it might be starting to unravel. Let me do the TikTok for you of that. So we obviously, as many countries, are under intense pressure right now due to the coronavirus, and that pressure is really, I think that it's obviously the factor here that's doing this. So the opening shot really for this was when Trump referred to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus. This was the immediate dividing line between where you're going to stand. Are you going to say, yes, I'm willing to use that phrase, or are you going to speak out against it? And very quickly we saw Democrats and Republicans pull to either side on this. And what we've seen from there is, one, a huge rise across the country in racism and racist attacks and remarks against Asian Americans, and Democrats really rallying to that and saying we need to protect these people, and deciding that the way they need to protect them is by not talking about China. That's been that decision. And Republicans have said China's trying to erase the truth. They did something bad. We need to make sure that that record is not erased. We need to point to them and make sure that they cannot rewrite history as it's happening and say that this did not start in Wuhan. So Republicans believe China's to blame for the global pandemic, and that Beijing's propaganda campaign aims to erase the truth. But Democrats say that emphasizing the coronavirus's links to China inflames racism against Asian Americans, and that it's a cover for the Trump administration's own mishandling of the epidemic. And I'd say in the past 2 weeks, we've really seen that taking off, with Republicans really doubling down on saying this is China's fault. We need to launch an investigation. We need to make it possible for Americans to sue China for damages. Let's talk about reparations. Trump just yesterday announced that the U.S. is going to freeze funding for the World Health Organization, in part because of how it has seemed to echo China's, Beijing's own rhetoric, the Chinese Communist Party's own rhetoric regarding the coronavirus. So you've seen such a doubling down, and I believe that it's in part, because China did cover it up, but it's also in part because they know that the Trump administration did not do a good job, especially in the first 2 months or the crucial 6 weeks from when we got our own first coronavirus cases up until they started, the curve of the number of cases started really rising exponentially. We're in the middle of a horrible crisis. The United States has the highest number of deaths of any country. We have the highest number of cases of any country. The emperor has no clothes. Our administration messed up. And it is, I think, easier for Republicans to point fingers at China than to acknowledge that. And Democrats don't want to let that happen. So the bottom line right now in DC is that pushing back against China in any way has become politically toxic for Democrats. They're seen as supporting racism and enabling the Trump administration. And I want to give an example of this. It's, I think, a perfect sort of tempest in a teacup to explain how exactly this is breaking apart the bipartisan consensus. There was a bipartisan resolution in the House that was introduced in late March. I read it. It was very factual. It was a TikTok of the early cover up. You know, this happened on this date. This happened on this date. China did this on this date. This doctor was arrested on this date. And then it said, but we know and everyone knows that the virus originated in Wuhan, and we don't believe Chinese disinformation. And then it condemned the detention camps in Xinjiang, and it also condemned the expulsion of American journalists. This is not controversial. It's not. It's very factual. Jim Banks, who is a pretty fiery Republican representative from Indiana, demanded that leaders in Beijing publicly state that there's no evidence that COVID-19 originated anywhere else but China. The resolution very notably avoided controversial phrases. It did not say Chinese virus or Wuhan virus. And Seth Moulton, who is a Democratic representative from Massachusetts, he was the only Democratic signatory on the resolution. He ended up retracting his support for the resolution after he came under heavy criticism from primary challengers and from Representative Judy Chu, a Democrat from California, and others. So I have the screenshot here of this tweet. This is from Roger Lau, who was the campaign manager for Elizabeth Warren for her presidential campaign. So a pretty prominent guy in the Democratic Party. And he said, responding to the introduction of this resolution, this is just so wrong. It's lazy scapegoating, hateful fear-mongering, and just flat out dangerous. And Asian Americans have been victims of hate crimes that have been incited by ignorance like this. This is a global crisis when we're all in this together. This seems to be a fairly, something of an overreaction to a very fact-based resolution. And you get a sense of the pressure that Democrats are under. I think to some extent from their base and from others, to distance themselves from anything the Trump administration is doing and anything that Republicans are doing related to China. So here's just a couple more quotes. This one on the left is from Judy Chu. This is her criticism of the resolution. During a pandemic like this, people are afraid and angry, and directing that anger towards China puts Asian, American, and Pacific Islanders at risk, as we have already seen with the insults and assaults against them. And Seth Moulton, when he withdrew his support for the resolution, said, the resolution has caused division, the substance overshadowed by President Trump's divisive, xenophobic attempts to deflect from his administration's abysmal response to this virus. I apologize for that, and I am withdrawing my support for the resolution. So to be clear, it is now politically unviable at this moment for Democrats to express support for condemning the concentration camps in Xinjiang, the expulsion of journalists from China. It's just too toxic. All of this is breathing new life back into the engagement narrative that we all thought was dead. Calls for cooperation, which are truly legitimate at this time, right? There must absolutely be public health cooperation, global cooperation right now. But I think the idea is that there's a strong sense among the pro-engagement crowd that they were right all along. You know, they can say, see, this is what happens when we don't cooperate. This pandemic wouldn't be so bad. The US-China relations wouldn't be so bad. This is what happens when you pursue hostilities. I will say, though, that the reason I have a question mark about whether or not the bipartisan consensus is really cracking is that this could get better when the coronavirus crisis passes. It's hard to say at this point. I don't know, but but a reason I think that we really are headed down a forking path here is because of the presidential election that is coming up. So I want to talk about that, China and the 2020 election. Hashtag Beijing Biden. The Trump campaign is planning to make Joe Biden's posture towards China one of its major lines of attack during the 2020 campaign. The politics surrounding the US relationship with China may become a bigger domestic issue in this campaign than in any presidential contest in the last half century. and Trump officials they'd already been planning to brand Biden as soft on China, but the coronavirus pandemic has stoked public anger towards Beijing and made the attack more resonant in polling. So this hashtag Beijing Biden is a reference to a campaign that is starting. There's a pro-Trump super PAC that this week is launching a website called, I think it's called BeijingBiden.com. Oh dear. They're also doing a bunch of ads that showcase that show Biden as being soft on China, as being an enabler, as opposing the life-saving measures that Trump has taken, such as the early travel ban on China. I think that was the end of January. So here's just a quick screenshot of one of these ads, and this is from a speech that Biden gave at Sichuan University. I believe it was in 2011. And here's, so they have, on this ad, they have the recording of his speech, and he says, "It's in our self-interest that China continue to prosper." And when that's sandwiched with, accusations against his son, Hunter Biden, and, potential financial benefits that Hunter Biden gets from China, and from other statements from Biden, the idea is that, Biden won't stand up to China. He's not willing to make Beijing suffer, and that's bad for America. So that's sort of my brief outline there. I welcome a Q&A with Simon and with all of you, and looking forward to talking more.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Bethany. And
yeah.
It's terrific when our guest actually prepares some slides like that to really frame the discussion. That's terrific. Look, there's a lot there I'd like to get into. I'll limit myself, though, to make sure we've got plenty of time for live questions from the floor. Bethany, I think one of the things that jumped out at me was one of your opening remarks, and that is your observation about the depth of anger in the U.S. population, that the attitude towards China is no longer a policy community inside the beltway phenomenon, but is now well and truly, in your characterization, sort of out and running in the general population. Now, part of that is we've got a reality piece to that, but we've also got some stoking of the fires by Trump. But just wondering, you mentioned some surveys. I'm just wondering if you could perhaps just tease out what it is you're seeing or hearing about the depth of that in the United States at the moment.
Yeah. Well, one of the, some of this is related to campaigns. And for example, I mentioned that there's this pro-Trump super PAC that is rolling out these ads against Biden and this week. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because their polling has indicated that the anti-China stuff and attacking Biden's China policy really resonates with the base right now.
Sure.
And that's unusual for China to really resonate with, a large group of people. It hasn't been a nationally resonant policy issue before. And now it seems that it is.
Yeah. We get to the States a lot. And as I said in the setup, this issue is just so central to the work of, myself and our foreign policy and defense team and many of our scholars and experts at the center. And that was our sense of it, right? That this was an issue that had tremendous currency and tremendous bipartisan support around inside Washington. But
right, yes.
The media and the general public, it was more about Russia to the extent there was a foreign policy, a bad actor out there. And so this represents, I think, a real sea change and not an unexpected one, given the circumstances you laid them out. The other thing I just want to pick up briefly, towards the end of your remarks, Bethany, you said the pro-engagement crowd who are they? Because they've been deep, deep underground for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Would be
Yes.
sense. And it was, Joe Hockey, the Australian ambassador, former Australian ambassador, just recently finished his term, but he used to say China hasn't got a friend in town, meaning DC. And I'd say, well, how about Silicon Valley, or how about Wall Street? And you go, oh well, maybe, and a little bit there, but who is the pro-engagement crowd after so many years of this, certainly inside DC consensus? Who are you referring to there? I just made a note of there. Who is that pro-engagement crowd in your view these days?
Yes. I will list some names, but before I do that, I want to say that these are just general names, and I am not pinning any statements to them at this time. So, but just as a general, answer to that question, it would be people like Susan Thornton. Actually, there's 3 Susans I can think of right now. We can just call them the Susans. Susan Thornton, Susan Shirk, and Susan Rice.
Susan. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Who else? There's a number of think tankers. I would, people who, certainly some people who were serving under Obama, maybe his earlier years. Those would come to mind. I think Susan Thornton is a really good person to have in mind as sort of an engagement type, and she was pushed out of state very early in the Trump administration.
Right. Okay.
And there's a long list of researchers and scholars who I would put in that, and they have been less quiet, but they're not in they're not in power, they're not in the administration, and so.
Understood. That's helpful. I think some context, and again, for Australian audiences, the think tank community in the United States is A, massive, and B, given the way that new administrations in the United States get to make a ton of political appointments into state, into the National Security Council, into the Pentagon, there's this sort of flip from when there's a change of party, right, Bethany? There's this sort of people leave government, and there is a think tank job often waiting for a lot of those people. And I think also, there's an understanding on the think tank side that A, that's in their interest, but B, people will go back into government if there's a change.
Yeah, that's right. You could almost say that think tanks are a piecemeal shadow government sometimes. Yeah.
Well, as someone that runs a think tank, I'll hold up on that. But anyway, look, let's get into some of the questions that have come up from the floor, because there's so much here, and this is a topic that, as I said, has so much salience in Australia. And so some great questions here. Look, I think a number of them, I'm just looking at the ones we got in as people signed up for the event. There's a number here, Bethany, that really, I think, more broadly fit under the topic of decoupling. And how you said earlier, America, and, I've heard former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd say this, America has an attitude about China. It doesn't really have a coherent policy. But there are elements of it, right? I mean, the decisions about Huawei and ZTE, the FBI and the Department of Justice more broadly really raising alarm bells about research collaborations around sensitive technologies, particularly for the higher ed sector that isn't accustomed to thinking about these matters perhaps in those terms. I'm wondering if you could perhaps give for an Australian audience a little bit of the lay of the land, or the extent to which, away from the obvious stuff about tariffs, other components of decoupling that, before COVID sort of started to dominate the headlines, that the United States and was sort of, components of that bipartisan consensus, perhaps you were talking about, or at least not getting a lot of pushback from Congress?
Sure. So the first year of the Trump administration, apart from the trade war, there was not there wasn't. It's not that there wasn't so much a China policy. There wasn't even an Asia policy. There was no coherent even statements about what that would be. Besides changing Asia Pacific Command to the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command. I mean, there was really nothing. So in the second year and the third year is when we really started to see more actions happening. So I would kind of characterize this administration's China policy as a series of campaigns rather than a series of policies. So it's like they identify, something that troubles them and they go on a campaign to try to fix that one issue in a whack-a-mole kind of a way. And they have done that with more and more and more issues. And so, we saw that with Huawei. They identified, Huawei as a national security and also a strategic problem. And approached it in a way that I find pretty typical of this administration, which is to try to stop something from happening, but without trying to replace it with anything.
Good point.
So it was, going and telling, especially European partners, don't partner with Huawei, but not trying to lead 5G development in any other way. And so then we started getting a big FBI campaign to the issues here, and this is where the bipartisan consensus comes in, is that pretty much everyone in DC recognizes that Huawei is a problem. And so there hasn't been a ton of Democratic pushback on these issues because we know it's a problem, just that no one is really knowing what to do about it. So whack-a-mole seems fine for now. And the same with the FBI crackdown on unreported, unregistered partnerships and research collaborations between U.S. medical institutions and scientists and universities and their Chinese counterparts, trying to get rid of those, trying to make people register, and indeed indicting some people for lying to the FBI, but without articulating what is actually okay. And definitely without articulating how can we continue international scientific collaboration while trying to keep America's national security interests secure. And I would say that we've seen not a snowball effect exactly, but more and more of these campaigns kind of coming out of a more confident administration. And I would say that, again, Secretary Pompeo has really gotten on board with this in the past year and a half. And so we've started to see the State Department take some, I would say, innovative steps with mixed results, but most certainly innovative. And we saw that this year with the State Department's designation of 5 Chinese state-run media outlets in the US as foreign missions, which was the first time that the Foreign Mission Act has ever been used in that way. And that forced these outlets to register with the State Department and stuff. Now, that ended up backfiring, and that's what eventually resulted in China expelling US journalists, which is exactly the reason that in years past, the principle of reciprocity, which is perhaps the closest thing that this administration, or one of the closest things that this administration has to laying out a principle for a policy. And that's the principle of reciprocity, as Pompeo has emphasized, which is that you treat us this way, we'll treat you that way. And the reason that that kind of principle has been controversial is for exactly this reason, that if you do something, then that it kind of gives cover for other governments to retaliate. And also it kind of looks like you're letting an authoritarian government set your own policies.
Sure.
I think that's sort of an outline there.
Sure, thanks. I guess since we're talking about 5G and some of these measures, Australia actually was the first of the Five Eyes partners to put up a hard wall against Huawei and ZTE on the 5G rollout. It comes after a few years down the track. A lot of Australians forget this, that a few years prior, the Australian government put up barriers to Huawei participating in the national broadband network here in Australia. But there's I think two questions here, Bethany. One is your sense of, does that have any visibility in the China watching community in Washington? The fact that an ally like Australia was actually out of the blocks a little earlier than the United States itself on these things. But also, the other thing I'd ping you on is there any the discussion in Washington around how this plays for allies? So here in Australia, there's a massive debate about, and it gets characterized, there are very sort of simple, almost cartoon-like versions of it. Australia's going to have to choose between China and the United States. There's a very sort of reductionist version of it. But a sense of the pressure that allies, Japan, South Korea, perhaps Australia as well, face in as the senior alliance partner, the United States, prosecutes a strategy, or at least gives voice to an attitude with gusto and sometimes not a lot of nuance or subtlety as the ally partners might prefer.
Yeah, sure. So I'll address the first question about Australia. My answer is going to be very much like more like pro-Australia, or like than maybe some people. Australia's China policy has loomed very large in my own mind for several years. I've followed it very closely. Australia has, as you know, really led the world in the conversation about China's covert influence and interference. And behind the scenes in Washington, so among people who really do China for a living in, numerous different offices in the government, and also among certain researchers and other people in the private sector, what Australia has done has been, I would say, almost a framework or something for the US to model its policies after. And I've seen that very clearly in policies that have come out of the Trump administration. That a lot of the stuff that this administration has done that I approve of are things that were tried first in Australia, or where the conversations were happening first in Australia. And because there was very close communications, through the Five Eyes partnership and other kinds of exchanges and communications between the two governments, it's just been so clearly an influence on what has happened in Washington, at least behind the scenes. That's not true by any means in terms of the national discussion, or even what more mainstream politicians are saying about it. But for example, Marco Rubio, I am sure, has followed what's happened in Australia extremely closely, and he's a very influential senator on the China issue. So certainly Australia has played an outsized role. And if you look at the 5G discussions, again, people in the US who pay attention to what's happening with 5G around the world have pointed to repeatedly both Australia's signals intelligence and UK's GCHQ, their signals intelligence, making statements, warning very strongly against Huawei, warning their own governments very strongly against Huawei. And I remember in December, I think it was ASPI that published a post from, I can't remember his name, but the former Australian head of signals intelligence saying that they had tried to game out any possible way to sort of contain, like, could we let Huawei into like the periphery of our networks? Like, is there a way to ameliorate or alleviate the possible risk? And the answer was no. So certainly Australia has been very, very boldly taking on China in that way, which is, it's really incredible to me for a country of Australia's size to do that. In terms of America's allies, our diplomacy our State Department has really been hollowed out in the past 3 years. And, not by no means entirely, but it's been given much less emphasis, and more of our policy is done by tweet or by sort of, swaggering announcement. And that certainly rubs many allies the wrong way. And if you look at Europe, Germany is a good example, but our allies in Europe, I think they feel so frustrated because on the one hand, you have, the US president saying really kind of horrid things about, the people who are our best friends. But then expecting them to fall right into line on Huawei. And again, with 5G, very specifically, why is it that Germany, that the UK, that now France have not simply said, oh, okay, United States, you say that you have intelligence that says Huawei is a risk. You're not showing us that intelligence. You're asking us to trust you. Why the conversations there behind the scenes are, if they it goes back to more than just this administration, through the NSA revelations, for example, in which, the US was doing things that were untrustworthy, even back to the Iraq War, when we said, just trust us, just trust us. And then now in the past 3 years, you have this, very swaggering kind of harsh statements. It feels like, like the US is just not treating them well, and that it's really hollowed out the trust there. Sure. That's certainly the feeling from Europe.
Sure. You raise a great point about, it's one thing to say no to Huawei and ZTE on 5G, but so what is the plan for 5G?
Yeah.
And that's perhaps a whole nother conversation that is more perhaps a tech talk than a US-China talk, but certainly a large part of the conversation here in Australia as well, by the way, and all around the world where governments are trying to figure out what to do here. There's a great question here from Alana Ford, who asks that US Attorney General Barr recently gave a keynote speech at the DOJ China Initiative, which I happened to be at in DC at CS. Yeah. And Barr, I remember it, Barr was a remarkable speech. He talked about China. This is the Attorney General. This is not the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. This is the Attorney General talking about China as being America's most significant geopolitical adversary, talking about economic security and sovereignty as being intertwined with national security, with 5G being kind of exhibit A for Barr. How do you see, in the question, how do you see this evolving, that conversation that is talking about sort of whole of government, whole of society level of the threat? The question is, does that COVID-19 has to elevate that, right, and give that added urgency in your view, or elaborate on that if you don't mind, Bethany?
You mean how China presents a sort of whole of society threat? Really,
how the narrative in the US and Australia to some extent, so this is not just a national security, economic security is national security. The two are so intertwined, and that speaks to sort of the novelty and comprehensiveness of the threat, number one, of the challenge, and hence of the response that's needed from national governments and the alliance network as well.
I think what's happened is that many of the things that seemed theoretical are now real in our houses, in our living rooms. I don't have a mask. I literally do not have a medical mask. And as of 2 days ago, we're not allowed to go into a public indoor space without one. And I don't have one. Why don't I have one? Because, most of the masks are made in China. And my experience is being replicated 50 million times across the United States. So a lot of the issues where people seemed, and by people I mean, prominent Republicans, prominent people in the Trump administration, they seemed like they were out there, like they were, who's talking about, decoupling? That's not realistic. What do you mean industrial policy? What is this? The Cold War? Those kinds of things now seem prescient, seem realistic, seem not radical anymore. And I think we will see that. I think we're only just beginning to see the ramifications of that, because And going back to an earlier point, everyday average Americans are experiencing what supply line security means in their daily lives. So I think, in this election year and going forwards, the conversation about China will be much more personal. I think people will be much more willing to consider ideas that they would not have considered before. And the idea of decoupling now, in fact, it no longer even seems like a US-China issue. It seems to some extent like a global issue, that countries around the world are realizing that even if they don't have some sort of geostrategic or geopolitical strategic rivalry with China, that it's not really safe for their populations to have a dependence on any single country anywhere.
Yeah.
And that maybe a sort of, each country needs to consider its own supply line security in the future.
Yeah, look, every morning in the Australian media, there's a story. We're speculating on that, and even a good friend of the US Study Centre, Australian expatriate, did very well in the US running Dow Chemical. Andrew Liveris, person, Dow has supported the US Study Centre over the years, and but Andrew is out there very vocally about Australia drank the globalization Kool-Aid, and it's time to, reevaluate that proposition. And meantime, think tank economists, one of ours is out there saying, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I thought that's a great observation, Bethany. Thanks. And that leads pretty naturally, if I may, to another look, a host of questions that come under this umbrella, and I'll try and summarize it with one. And so what happens if Biden wins? So if there is a change of government, what happens in terms of policy, given, as you've just been articulating, Bethany, this realization at a mass level and sort of the jolt of relevance that China now has in mass American public opinion? Where would that take a future US administration? One, presumably, if there were to be a change of government, would be led by Joe Biden.
Yeah, great question. It's interesting because, for the past several years, people like me who are, do China for their career, a bit hawkish, have wondered, what will happen to the bipartisan consensus? What will happen to China policy if a Democrat, the next time a Democrat is in office? And obviously the past 2 months have kind of thrown that up in the air. What will happen? 6 months ago, if you had asked me that question, I would have said, or even 3 months ago, I would have said, engagement is dead. And, there's no going back to that. And Democrats are going to have to learn how to differentiate a more realistic, a more, realpolitik kind of approach to China, but of their own, differentiate it from the Republicans, but have to find a way to do that themselves. Now, I think it's really hard to say, and I think in the next few months, maybe it'll become a bit more clear as the narrative around the coronavirus maybe settles a bit, because now you have two really totally opposite forces. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is this is the fear of racism in this country, and the real racism that's happening, and the belief that we need to speak more carefully about China in order to protect our Chinese Americans. That's a really strong, deep core impulse of the Democratic Party. On the other hand, there is, 30,000 Americans have died now of the coronavirus, and that is in part, undeniably, to some extent, because of the Chinese system, because of how it rewards cover-ups and suppression of information, and that has come to our own shores. So there are these two divergent, really strong forces, and what Biden will have to do is walk a very fine line between them, and to do a better job of differentiating between fighting racism and fighting Chinese authoritarianism. These are separate things, right? They've gotten a bit joined in Democratic Party rhetoric. And that's a big, big challenge, I think, that he will face. So to answer your question, what might a Biden government look like? It depends very much on the people that he gets,
Sure.
and who he chooses. He could, for example, go the Pete Buttigieg route. Mayor Pete had some really sharp China advisors who were very, very up on the whole influence interference thing, but in a really smart, like pro-civil rights kind of way. He could kind of go that way. Or he could go into a more, I'm not going to say engagement, but like we need to stand with our allies and partners, to support democratic norms, but not really do much about it. We'll have to see.
Sure. Just picking up a few again, some of these questions. John von Koalis, who's a professor of Chinese studies at the University of New South Wales, our crosstown rival, as it were, asks a really great question. COVID-19 has blasted Xinjiang and Hong Kong off the headlines for a while. I'm just wondering, your sense of that. Where does that sit in the China conversation in Washington at the moment? Is it sort of just wrapped up in that broader narrative? You're talking about civil rights earlier as being sort of a big possible component of a policy frame. Just has COVID-19 just blasted that away and everything's about sort of resilience and sovereignty and supply chains? What about the human rights agenda?
That'll come back. I think right now, our house is on fire, and so that's all we're going to talk about for now. But those are really, really deep and lasting issues that have a huge amount of, I guess, as an issue, they have a huge amount of support that runs very, very deep in the U.S. and the human rights community, and among politicians, among researchers and journalists. So I think once our crisis starts to settle down, those issues really will come back. And one reason that I think that is that certainly on the national, in our national debate, we're not talking right now about the detention camps in Xinjiang, but people who focus on China are still talking about them. And it comes up, for example, because we're very concerned about what might be happening in those camps. What happens if there is a COVID-19 outbreak in one of those camps? Because we're not going to know, like they're going to suppress that information. And it's very, very bad health conditions there, overcrowding. It's a terrible concern. And the fact that we are having those conversations amongst ourselves, I think indicates that that this is a strong and lasting issue. So those, I think, will definitely linger and continue to go strong in the future.
We've got about 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to we might try and do a little bit of rapid fire, but I don't want to compromise the answers you're giving. They're fantastic. Look, there's a question here from Isabel Wolfensberger. Should the coronavirus further weaken the less developed nations in the Asia-Pacific region, paving the way for China to have a stronger regional presence? Is that going to have an implication for American posture in the region? As you'd be aware, the US has a Marine deployment in Darwin, Australia's most northern city. Isabel draws attention to that. I'm just wondering if is the policy community in DC starting to think through China being opportunistic in the region and what a US response might be?
Yes, people are paying attention to that. For example, just as an example, in the East and South China Seas, there are people paying very close attention to see if China might make a kind of not a land grab, I guess a sea grab, if you will. Yeah, there are people who are really keeping close eyes on this. We do fully expect China to try to take as much as it can right now. It has a bit of a relative advantage, right? Because it was the first place where there was the epidemic, and thus it was one of the first to come out of it. And so while other countries in the region and around the world are kind of down, it's in a relatively strong position. And one other, aspect that people are watching very closely, relatedly, is will China go on a big buying spree? Is it gonna buy up a bunch of distressed assets? Whether that's mines or financial institutions or land, even these kinds of things. So there is a lot of attention being played to that, being placed on that. I do not foresee the U.S. Being so paralyzed that we're not able to engage or respond in the Asia Pacific. Even now, I don't see that unless things get dramatically worse here. I think it's really hard to say at this point, in terms of maybe sort of bilateral relations between, I don't know, China and Thailand or something, China and Vietnam. If those countries, if countries in Southeast Asia are significantly weakened, what that calculus will be, but between China and that country, that's a lot of countries and a bit hard to predict. But I do foresee the U.S. still being very strong there.
One thing we've got, again, a couple of questions from, and I'll try and consolidate them. How seriously in DC is this sort of hypothesis that the virus started life in a bioweapons state lab? Now, is that, just blame game, Trump being Trump and his supporters in, unconventional media outlets, shall we? And sometimes conventional ones, by the way, giving a bit of oxygen to that. On the other hand, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff got asked about it and gave what I thought was a pretty measured response, and at least seeming to indicate that serious people are seriously interrogating the hypothesis. How it's happening so fast, Bethany, hard to pass, so much it's coming out of DC from this distance. Can you just signpost that a little for us, best you can?
Yeah, I will say that it is being these conspiracy theories are actually being are actually being taken very seriously, and I consider them to be conspiracy theories, and they should not be taken seriously. And I find it alarming that they are, especially the one about the virus, potentially having originated in a Chinese bioweapons facility. Mm-hmm. That one is just false, because no credible epidemiologist in the world thinks that the virus shows any signs of having been manipulated. Now, that particular idea, I think, has a lot less currency now than it did a month ago. I mean, I speak with a lot of people in the administration. I speak with people on the Hill. Many people have come to me and said, "What do you think about this? This seems, is this possible? I think it seems pretty legit." And I'm always like, no, it's not legit. Another thing that we've seen just in the past, yesterday and then I think a week ago, there's been this succession of leaks from White House officials or from administration officials, intelligence officials, saying that perhaps the Chinese government knew about this in November, that maybe the virus originated not in a bioweapons facility, but at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where it wasn't being engineered, but it was being studied, and then it was accidentally, someone there got it and they accidentally, transmitted it outside of that facility. Let me just say about that there is absolutely insufficient evidence that is currently publicly available to judge the veracity of that in one way or another. And we don't even know where it's coming from inside the administration. We don't even know who is saying this or why. So on that particular one, it's not a crazy thing to think. It's an unlikely thing, but it's not crazy. So I feel like it is like 20% of my job these days, just urging caution to everyone and to say, please wait until we know more. But overall, I would say I have seen a plethora of really wild ideas. And the reason for that is because this is a time of great fear and great uncertainty. And in times like that, people are willing to believe things that don't seem possible, because we're currently living through a time that doesn't seem possible, but it's real. So I urge caution.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. We're at the top of the hour. We're out of time. I could keep going for another hour easily. Bethany, thank you so much. We're so grateful for this hour you've given us, Bethany. And moreover, the analytical clarity of your answers. They were just terrific. I really hope we can do this again. This was immensely valuable.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation. I was so glad to be able to join you, and best of luck. Stay
Okay.
safe.
And everybody, please, there's the website over my shoulder, ussc.edu.au. Please take a look there. We've got our researchers are producing a ton of content at the moment related to COVID-19, how it's playing out for the Australia-US bilateral, how it's playing out in the US, impacting US politics, but indeed, as today's conversation indicates, the consequences for US foreign policy, which have obvious and immediate implications for those of us here in Australia. We've got more webinars coming up. Look for those on our website. But that's it for today. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.